Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. Let me tell you what we're going to be doing today. Our plan is to have a discussion focused on the workers' compensation regulatory response to COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to speak with you for about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes, and then we'll leave 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. However, if somebody poses a question that our screeners think is particularly hot, so to speak, we will probably put that question through. We're being assisted today by two people from Ametros, Melanie Salomon and Melissa Wright, and without their assistance, this would be very difficult to do. Let me introduce our panel. One of our members is going to appear only by audio. He is Todd Brown. Todd is the Practice, Compliance, and Regulatory Affairs Leader at Medata. I met Todd about shortly after I became a regulator, probably about 8 or 9 years ago. He is the former Executive Director of the Texas Workers' Compensation Board. A mutual friend of ours, Joe Peduta, once wrote this about Todd. He has been in workers' compensation business since, well, forever. He is an expert, and I mean really knowledgeable, completely locked in, unbelievably well committed to the dense, complex, convoluted world of workers' compensation regulatory affairs. But in addition to that, he is a nice guy, he's approachable, and above all else, he is likable. Todd, would you like to add to that, or are you going to live with what I had to say?
No, I think my brother Joe did a good job. I really appreciate my brother doing that.
Thank you. Our other panelist, who you'll be able to see today, is Wes Marshall. Joe did not write anything about Wes. I look for that. Judge Marshall hails from Richmond, Virginia. After graduating from Mr. Jefferson's College and law school again at the University of Virginia, he established a law practice primarily representing plaintiffs and claimants. After years of meaningful practice, he was appointed to the Virginia Workers' Compensation Commission in 2012 and reappointed again in 2018. He is one of their 3 commissioners. The Virginia system is interesting in that they have 3 commissioners and they have an administrative end. The 3 commissioners serve as appellate-level judges, so he is a judge as well as being a commissioner. And they oversee the operations of the Virginia Commission. Commissioner Marshall is a fellow in the College of Workers' Compensation Lawyers, and he has held positions with SACA, the Southern Association of Workers' Compensation Administrators, and with the IAIABC, the International Association of Industrial Accident Boards and Commissions. Judge, Commissioner Marshall, would you like to add to this introduction?
No, you said way too much. Thank you, though, for having me today.
And by the way, you and I have known each other for a while. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Do you mind if I refer to you as Wes as opposed to Judge and as opposed to try to be deferential to you folks, you know, when we're dealing with it? And I'm your moderator. I'm Paul Sighinolfi. I worked as a trial lawyer for 30 years with a focus on workers' compensation. I represented injured workers, and I also did some defense work. So I walked both sides of the streets. I then became the executive director and chairman of the Maine Workers' Compensation Board, a position that I held for 8 years. 14 months ago, I was offered an opportunity to reinvent myself, and I joined Ametros as a senior managing director. Ametros professionally manages Medicare set-aside accounts. Ametros has afforded me the opportunity to organize and moderate this webinar, and I thank them for that opportunity. Gentlemen, the World Health Organization tells us that COVID-19 virus was first detected in China last year. It spread to the United States, and on or about January 20th, we had our first diagnosed case in Washington State. Since that time, it has reached pandemic status. Todd, where are you right now?
I work from home. I live in Jacksonville, Texas. So at this point, in our county, we only have 6 cases. We've had no deaths, and that 6 has been stable for the last 2 weeks. So we're I'm not saying we're immune from it, but the growth rate in our area is not bad at all.
And Wes, where are you? I see a number of books behind you.
Yeah, I'm at my home in Richmond, Virginia, and we are a metropolitan area. We have a fair bit of activity with the virus at this point, and we are still on the upswing. Our predictions for Virginia are that this thing will not peak here until probably the end of, the end of April, early May, something like that.
Okay. Todd, do you know if any state had pandemic disaster plans before February of this year? And let me put that question in context. We know that HIV/AIDS was big in the 80s and 90s, and frankly is still with us today, but there were people who were talking about that being somewhat of a pandemic. We know SARS was around in 2003, and that is the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And again, that was something that looked like it was going to become of pandemic proportions. We know that Ebola was around in 2014, and again, there was this general panic about having this pandemic. And then I have to tell you, I have this with me today. This is written, I was on a board of directors of the Bangor Y, and this was for the fellow board member, Stephen King. In 1978, he wrote The Stand, and he talked about a pandemic, a virus that got loose actually from an American military facility. So did anybody think ahead and think that maybe the workers' compensation regulatory community should plan for something like this? Todd, you're the one who seems to have his fingers on actions like regulatory actions. Tell me what you know.
Well, Paul, and I appreciate you bringing up some of the other issues we faced over the last 20 years, SARS, HIV, Ebola. In each of those cases, there was really sort of a very limited target group of people that were really at full risk. I know most every state, I know most every organization, every company has what they call disaster recovery. That is primarily focused on such things as hurricanes, flooding, earthquakes, and typically what that means is if your IT facility goes down, you've got a backup somewhere. I don't know anybody ever sat around thinking, okay, what are we going to do if the entire population of the United States has the potential of being exposed to this? This is like if the U.S. was hit with a tsunami wave and it hit from California to New York. So I don't think anyone ever really sat around thinking about this in the work comp arena. I just don't think it was something feasible. So I don't think anyone really sat and thought about it. And I think that makes what we've seen, as you said, the first case was diagnosed in January. What we've seen in middle of February through today, the response from the regulatory agencies has been truly phenomenal. They have completely set aside decades of tradition, protocol, and worked very hard to protect their employees, the injured workers, and the financial stability of the employers. I've never seen the industry move so quickly, and particularly the regulatory group. An example of that, telemedicine. And I know Commissioner will agree with me.
Todd, but let's give Wes an opportunity to tell us about, specifically about his state, the state of Virginia.
Well, we I think have done a good job with planning. At our agency, we have a COOP plan, or a continuity of operations plan. We go through mandatory training every year on it. We didn't have scenario. We've never rehearsed a scenario of a pandemic. And most of the continuity of operation plans for governmental agencies, I think, are sort of aimed at some sort of a catastrophic technology failure or loss of data. The grid shuts down, that sort of thing, and how do you get back up? But the truth of it is, what I've observed over the last 2 weeks is that the skeleton, the framework, the organization of that continuity of operations plan really helps you to sort of decide what's important, focus on it, and and really sort of be prepared. With regard to pandemic, something that I didn't know until about 2 weeks ago, but it was very interesting, was our Supreme Court had developed a pandemic response plan for the court system in Virginia in 2007. And it was updated, I think, either in 2016 or 2017. And so what we've seen with the court system is that they have actually followed that plan to the extent they can, and they had it ready to go. It's about a 40-page book that said, if you get hit with a pandemic, here are the concerns, and we can't predict and anticipate everything, but here are some approaches. So there are a number of things that the court system did, literally pulling it out of the book.
What gave them the foresight to do that, Wes? Was there somebody who was very forward thinking?
I think it must have been. I really do, because I have not seen other court systems with something that was that particularized, and it really was a very, very thorough thing. We have had in our state, we really have a history of very, very strong emergency management, and we were involved firsthand with the response to 9/11 at the Pentagon, and I think that everybody sort of woke up at that point and said this needs to be a real part of government operations.
You and I and Todd have talked about this presentation in recent days. Something came up in Virginia this week that prompted you to change things pretty significantly in your state. Tell us what happened in Virginia and what you're doing as a result.
We were doing a warm-up for the webinar today, and I got an email in the midst of that on, I think it was Tuesday, saying we had an employee who was beginning to exhibit symptoms. Now, we had sort of, in implementing our continuity of operation plan, we had moved as many people off into a full-blown telework status as was possible. So we really had a skeleton crew in our headquarters building for the last 3 weeks or so. But we did identify an employee who we believe may have the virus, and they were in the building up through March 20. All of this is public information that was released through press releases from the agency.
Be careful, Judge.
And so from there, we sort of had to go forward and say, so what do we do now? Because we had someone who may have been sick in the building. So the short-term plan was to close our headquarters operation, which is 2/3 or more of our entire operations. That basically forced a full shutdown of our judicial operations. We immediately contracted with a company to come in and do a deep clean on the 125,000 square foot headquarters building. That happened over the last 2 days. And I think I have not seen a final on this, but I think as of this morning, we've got the all clear to reopen the building. And we'll probably not do that until the next few days. We're still exploring sort of what is the impact of dealing with somebody who potentially had the virus in the building, and what that means for any of our other staff who may have been in the building in that period of time. So we're working through all the nuts and bolts of that. It's a rapidly developing situation. I would say that really, to me, the two big takeaways from what I've seen over the last 3 or 4 days is, number one, the flexibility to move rapidly is pretty important. Number two, I do think we were right in sort of being very aggressive in moving folks into a telework status. The broader state government actually had some wide-ranging approval of FEL leave, a health emergency leave. And so even for folks who are not eligible for telework, they had this opportunity to be able to get some leave while they're physically out of the location. But we didn't come into this expecting that we were going to have to physically shut down the building. That was not in the plan.
Let me ask you some specific questions about various departments within your agency, and then we'll get to Todd, who's going to tell us what's been going on more nationally. So how are you doing mediations? How are you doing formal hearings? You're an appellate judge. How do people do their appellate work given this present situation, or is it just at an absolute standstill?
Well, and until the building closed, things were actually moving along. So judicial functions, really what we did was, number one, with regard to appeals, we mostly use a record appeal process. It has been automated with video capability for staff attorneys, although we really only had one of our staff attorneys preparing cases for deliberation by video presentation. But in short order, we had the one person who was doing the case presentations that way, do some quick informal training, upload it on everybody's remote computers. And so we now have the full coterie of staff attorneys doing regular case presentations. And until we closed the building, our appellate work was going forward just like regular. The ADR and mediations were set up for primarily for telephonic processes a long time ago, and we've been doing that for a long time. So to the extent that parties were willing to shift from an in-person presentation to a telephonic, ADR has been moving right along as well. The more difficult challenge has been for the judicial branch at the hearing level, because we did not have a fully extensive video hearing capability. We had sort of explored it and played around with it, and really didn't have the wherewithal or the need to implement it on a full-scale basis. We have gone into high gear on that. We had a project management team that sat down and developed or figured out which platforms we could use for video hearings. We had another group of our hearing officers who worked very diligently over the last week and a half to come up with the short form rule modifications for video hearings. We expect to start actually conducting essentially beta testing for a number of those video hearings in about a week to 10 days out. And our goal is to pick up our regular hearing schedule as of May 1 and basically be able to go forward at that point.
I had a conversation yesterday. I've had actually a number of very interesting conversations this past week with people involved in various aspects of workers' compensation. One of which was with one of the AOJs yesterday, who was telling me that they're doing, in his jurisdiction, they're doing a lot of things telephonically, but he really misses being able to watch witnesses and see witnesses and essentially get the firsthand feel for what the witnesses were saying. And I think that that'll be an interesting transition for the judicial community, the judicial community within the workers' compensation world. Todd, tell me what you're observing, and I have to tell you, you have been incredible in the past 2 weeks in inundating me with information about what's going on with all the different jurisdictions. My God, it's about an hour ago you were sending me things. But what's going on generally with the jurisdictions that you're broadly monitoring?
Well, as I said earlier, given the last, I'll say, 6 to 8 weeks, the amount of changes that have occurred in the work comp regulatory judicial processes, which, in reality, workers' comp is a specialty court. And I think sometimes we lose that. Even those agencies that are more administrative, they're still a specialty court. And what I've seen, the commissioner brought up a good point. Video conferencing, it's been around for about 5 or 6 years, being discussed at the IAIBC and SOCA. Yeah, we might do it. Some have done it. What I have seen over the last 8 weeks is a huge shift for video conferencing and teleconferencing for hearings, mediations. It's just remarkable. Telemedicine is another thing that's been around for 4 or 5 years. There's been a few states that sort of adopted it, but others have sort of held back. The work comp industry has always looked very cautiously before they instituted new techniques. They wanted to understand the long-term effects. Here again, 6 to 8 weeks ago, there were a few states that had telemedicine ingrained in workers' comp. There were a few more that had it across the board for general health and insurance. But in the last 6 to 8 weeks, I can't think of a state that hasn't addressed telemedicine, telerehab. They are just various levels. Some a little later than others. They constantly update and refine that. I have never seen the industry respond as quickly and as positively as the regulators in workers' comp as they have for the pandemic. And you mentioned something that
are they modifying their rules, or are they simply doing it by sort of regulatory fiat?
some do rule modification, others are issuing orders. Most agencies have the ability to issue an order. So there are a number of things that are happening. Almost every state allows the adoption of an emergency rule. So you're not totally out of the rule process, but you short cycle that rule. So that's what you're seeing is orders, which would maybe be considered a fiat, direction or guidance, which from my perspective would tell me that if I dispute something in telemedicine and I'm reading the guidance from the agency that tells me this is how we view it, I'm probably going to lose on appeal. You don't have to always make something a hard, fast rule. You can just say, here's how we view it. So I've seen a number of things, probably the most prominent are bulletins or orders. That's the thing that I see most often given direction. So I would say that's it. And I don't see that it has led up, as you mentioned, the last couple of weeks. I've inundated a lot of people. But what I've seen over the last 2 or 3 days, that has curved down. States are really getting comfortable where they're at. They might make a tweak here or there, but I'm not seeing the massive notifications and adjustments that I've seen over the last 3 weeks.
Are you seeing a difference between the monopolistic states and the states that have all kinds of carriers writing business?
Not really. I mean, the difference is in a monopolistic state, they're really giving guidance to their healthcare providers. They're not giving guidance to carriers. But for example, if you look at Washington and Ohio, they're monopolistic states. However, they allow self-insurance. So they've got to provide that direction as well. So I don't see a huge difference. I mean, the response times have been pretty remarkable in how they make adjustments.
Is there any state that stands out that that if you were to give a gold star and say, listen, you're at the head of the class here?
Oh, golly, things happen so quickly. I would say across the board, probably Ohio was one of the very first early states to try to deal with pandemic before it became pandemic level in their state.
Yeah.
But quite frankly, when you look back, less than 8 weeks ago, this was still something people wasn't sure they were going to get. So I think once it started, it went pretty quickly. I think all states have done a remarkable job.
I received an email yesterday from a California attorney who was telling me that how pleased he was with the way that their state, his state, adapted and how well things are moving forward. In fact, he reported he was quite busy trying to keep up with things because of the way things have been moving. And if he were to broadly characterize what's been going on, is that they have relaxed the formalities. Is that what you're seeing, Wes? A relaxation of formalities?
Yes, definitely. And it's to sort of echo what Todd said. It's been very interesting to me to watch from state to state the responses on how states are sort of enacting change. Some states, like ours, sort of the commission is a little sensitive because we have a significant judicial role and capacity. And some other states, the workers' comp system seems to be a little more regulatory. So I've seen a number of states enact some just regulatory advisories or new regulations dealing with really sort of substantive issues that would be substantive law issues, in our state. So yeah, kind of wide variety, and
Let me shift gears here a bit, and I'm doing this shift in large part because I still occasionally think of my world as a regulatory world. Most states' workers' compensation boards, commissions, agencies, no matter what you call them, receive no general fund money. Instead, they get no taxpayer support. Instead, their budgets are entirely made up of funds that they get from the insurance community from the self-insurance community, when they look at what the premium is going to be written in their state, and they do an assessment, a percentage of that money is going to come to us to operate our budget. Todd, you probably have a pretty good feel for this. Have there been discussions with the regulatory agencies with concerns about what the premium is going to look like as a result of this general shutdown of many businesses, and the fact that many of the class codes that produce big premiums are the kinds of people who are presently not working, and I think specifically of the construction industry. Have you any discussions with the regulators about that?
You know, I haven't heard a lot of that, but what I will say is over the last probably 10 years, there has been I mean, every state is proud of it. Premiums have dropped. I mean, claims are down, frequency's down, severity still tends to be challenging, but overall claims have dropped. And so states have already had to deal with shrinking premiums and reduced revenue from the premium tax. Most states have flexibility to adjust that to meet their budgetary requirements. Some states have a cap on how much they can adjust it. But I mean, right now, I don't know that anybody's really given a lot of thought to that, and I'm not criticizing them. I think that's going to be phase two. Okay, wait a minute. We now have 50% less premium in this state. We still have the budgetary requirements we need. Can we get it out of the premium tax, or is there going to have to be some general revenue funds added in? And for the most part, most states work off a premium tax of some types. So, but I haven't seen any discussion of that right now. I don't even know if it's something you're focusing on, and I wouldn't blame them. I wouldn't if I were a regulator at this point.
Yeah, you know, from a regulatory perspective, I was always concerned about our state's budget and whether I had all the positions that I needed to have to run the agency and whether I had them all filled. And I think with these, I think the forward-thinking regulators are going to have to start thinking about the economics of their board as opposed to the economics of society at large. Wes, during the course of Todd's comments, I saw you cringe a few times. What's going on in Virginia?
Well, I mean, you're exactly right. I think the most important thing Todd said was that that's sort of the longer term problem, but I think the people who are wise are jumping on that pretty quick, both from our executive branch and on an inside the agency basis. We've started looking at predicted budgetary impacts. The governor of Virginia asked every state agency to sort of start doing some projections about revenue projections and where we might be. So we've been providing those on a regular basis, but inside we're already starting to plan for what things might look like differently in terms of a budget scenario, what we might do as a result of that. And tied in with that is also, you know, I'm beginning to wonder, are we going to see a significant slower down period in terms of claim filing? As I've started to think about this over the last week or so, I went earlier this week and asked our EDI folks, you know, did we see any different in terms of claim filing in March versus January and February? And the answer was no, but I think that's too soon to hit. I think we're going to see a significant downturn in claims coming in, which means somewhere down the line, 4 or 6 months out, we will probably see a reduced workload as a result of that. And so that's going to fit in with the budgeting process. Now, one of the other things that is interesting, but may not really be a solution, is that right in the short term, all of the unemployment agencies have a monstrous need. Our governor gave a press conference last week pointing out the fact that you know, the system was really getting hit hard with incoming claims. Janet Yellen reported this morning that she thinks that the United States nationwide, we're probably at 12-13% unemployment. And since the beginning of this pandemic, on a national level, almost 17 million people have filed for unemployment. So there is some possibility of shifting resources interagency if that's something that can be done. We've had some very, very informal discussions about it, and it's kind of a work in progress.
Yeah, to follow up on Todd's comment about, the possibility of taking some general fund money and putting it into a workers' compensation agency, it seems to me that one of the issues is that tax revenue is going to be down pretty significantly as well. Not only, not only premium money. Let's shift a little bit here, and I know that Todd has been chomping at the bit to talk about this one. Medical care.
Just for a minute, I'll be right back.
Medical care. We hear that traditional routine medical visits are being curtailed. We hear it is difficult to see a medical provider given the present status of things. What are you hearing, Todd?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, the business I'm in, we basically deal with medical bills, and we deal with requests for treatment. We've seen a decline in that, in the number of bills coming in and the number of requests coming in. Doesn't surprise me, and I think I think that's going to be going for a while, but I think it's going to be pent up need. What I think is happening is a choice, really. You tell someone to go to the doctor, and they say, well, I don't want to get out. I don't want to go into a doctor's office where other people might be infected. Yeah, I can wear a mask that keeps me from infecting people, but I really have no protection if someone else in there has it, which is true. So if you send them to the doctor and they contact Coronis because they went to that doctor visit, does that part and parcel become part of the claim? And now you've increased the value of a claim. I think that as we start easing up, we keep talking about we need to open up. I think that's probably one of the first things that I would say you'd want to figure out is how you can ease it up to let people go to the doctor, to see the doctor for a sprained ankle, for a rotor cuff, for some other type of work comp injury. Because if they're not going to the doctor, you don't know if they're MMI, and if they're not MMI, then they're still indemnity. And so that's a delicate balance I think the agencies are going to be dealing with. And just in general, how do you move that? But definitely medical bills are down. I think as telemedicine gets deployed, we'll see that move up some. But right now, medical bills are trending downward, yes.
Let me ask you this. Is it that let's assume that somebody's working today or was working yesterday and had an injury of some sort. They sustained, they fell, they hurt their back, they hurt their arm or something. Are they having a difficult time from what you can tell getting into a doctor, or are the doctor's appointments being impacted on the patient who's had a course of treatment and needs to go back to see the doctor simply in follow-up? Or is it both?
Well, I think it's both a little bit, although I think the sudden impact injury is probably able to get treatment, although many times that's the emergency room. And as we know, the emergency rooms are completely overpowered by the coronas. So I think that can impact when they actually get in for the first visit. I know there's several, just in my area, doctor's offices that have shut down. They're not really dealing with coronas, and they're not dealing with any patients. I think the ongoing treatment is probably impacted a little more. I mean, when I look at bills coming in, most of the bills coming in are for claims that have been established 5-6 months ago. So when I see a downtrend in that tells me people are holding off going back for follow-up visits because of fear of coronas.
Let me ask Wes, what's your sense of what's going on in Virginia with regard to medical treatment? Are people continuing to treat? Are they able to get into doctors if they've had a recent injury?
So what we've seen is, as far as outside of the hospital acute care setting, folks are moving. A lot of the practice groups, even the specialty practice groups, are using telemedicine on a very, very aggressive basis. I mean, we've seen practices just actually sort of changing over how they're doing business in a very short period of time. They're also engaged in, some triage on the basis of meeting need and also trying to design their processes to make things work. So, we're seeing a lot more folks getting telephone calls and having their appointments by telephone is the big observation.
Okay. And Virginia just put together a medical fee schedule a couple of years ago. Is that right? When did you implement this?
Went live January 1, 2018.
Okay. What are you doing? Have you modified your CPT codes to deal with telemedicine differently than traditional medicine, or do they charge out at the same rate?
Yeah. So we had a regulatory advisory group that was tasked by the legislature to sort of develop the fee schedule as a whole, and we had discussions 3 years ago about telemedicine. And it really was such a small percentage of the overall billed medical that regulatory advisory group said, just leave it alone. We'll do bill reviews, we'll do UCR, and we'll figure out pricing for it. So when we started to see things change here in the last few weeks, I made some inquiries, and where we sort of left it as a result of development of the fee schedule was that telemedicine would just be billed as a max percent of charges. So it's basically 80% of billed charges is a fixed cap for it, but the parties can negotiate as they would like to otherwise. Some of those folks ultimately may look back a year or two and say, well, we probably should have priced that specifically, but that's where we are.
And are you hearing anything from the carrier community? Are they accepting the fact that telemedicine is the option of choice these days, so to speak?
I have not heard anything specifically in terms of feedback from them. Certainly no complaints or anything. So it may sort of still be too soon to tell too.
Yeah. Todd, when we're talking about medicine, frequently people limit their thinking to physicians, to nurse practitioners, to people like that. What about home health aides, nurse case managers, physical therapy, occupational therapy? What are you seeing with those populations? Are they continuing to provide services? Are they willing to provide services in this era?
Yeah, a couple things. One, home health, I think definitely yes. I mean, this is more of a personal. I have a daughter-in-law that is a home health nurse to children that have to have 24/7 care, and that service is continuing. I mean, without them there could be dire consequences. In terms of physical therapy and occupational therapy, again, what I've seen is a few states have adopted guidelines or bulletins for telerehab. That hasn't been as evasive as telemedicine or telehearings or video conferencing, but I am seeing they are doing that as well. Obviously, the problem with physical therapy or occupational therapy is typically you have to be observing what they're doing to see if they're making progress. And you can't do that over the phone. You have to do a video conference. But there are some regulations out there. I expect there to be more that will allow for that. And as far as the industry, the insurance industry, I think they're willing to make these adjustments, to look at telemedicine, to embrace it, because like I said, if you don't, then you're looking at extending a claim maybe longer than you need to extend it. So I think they're open to what is best for the injured worker and their employer base as well.
Okay, let's talk now about claim filings. Wes, you told us a short while ago that the central office in Virginia was officially closed on Tuesday. Has Virginia had any COVID-19 first reports of injury with the allegation that this is the nature of the injury that I sustained? I had COVID-19 exposure.
So, the IA organization moved pretty quickly on this and established new COVID-19 nature and injury codes for the EDI transactions for electronic reporting from employers. And that's something that we can track very closely. Virginia, we do have one senior health assisted living facility that has made a lot of news because of a high rate of infection there. So I didn't have any idea where we were because I hadn't even, I think the IA stood up the nature and injury code about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. I checked on Tuesday, and at least as far as employer reports of employees with a nature and injury code of COVID-19 in Virginia, on Tuesday, it was 304. I checked this morning, and it was 471. And those are 471 separate cases. So it went up by a third in 2 days, and we're on the front end of this.
And when they're filing those claims, do you have a sense where they're filing? They're going to be occupational disease claims, or they're going to be traditional workers' compensation injury claims?
I really don't know. And in Virginia, we have a very narrow injury by accident definition. So, and then we have a very high bar for occupational disease. And so there have been some movements in the jurisprudence, in the law, with regard to how long an exposure can occur to be considered within the definition of an injury. And then we have traditionally, for years and years and years, had a very, very high bar on occupational disease in terms of the causation test. Larson actually, when in the lead treatise on workers' compensation, pointed out that it was one of the most restrictive in the country. We also have a dichotomy, Paul, where this is where I think it's really going to shake out, and some interesting questions may arise. We have a dichotomy between compensable occupational diseases and compensable ordinary diseases of life. And the causation test is higher for an ordinary disease of life than it is for a true occupational disease. Think asthma versus black lung. Black lung is something you only get in the work environment. Asthma is something you can get in the work environment if you're a baker or work as a meat cutter, but other people in the population have it unrelated to work. And so how these things get classified in that dichotomy is going to be interesting to watch.
Let me share with you a conversation I had yesterday with a psychiatrist. I was talking with him about possibly doing a program with me in the future. We were talking about this pandemic, and he said to me he thought that there would be an increase in emotional injury claims associated with the COVID-19, in large part because people who are working in positions where they're essentially compelled to be exposed, that is, the healthcare providers, the grocery store checkout clerk, the retail salesperson, to the extent that retail sales is open. They're going to be exposed to extraordinary and unusual stress that they've never felt before. And he believes that there may be a spike in emotional injuries with maybe no physical component other than the fact that they ran a fever for a short period of time, or they were exposed to somebody who was coughing. Todd, what are you hearing about what's going on in claim filings nationally?
Well, what I can go by what we see with our client base, and actually at this point of the last 2 weeks, the number of claims filed was down a little bit. Not necessarily unusual. We don't know if it's because of that, because of unemployment, or just there has been a general trend in reduction in frequency of claims. I will have to say, though, the thing that shocked me is the fact that Virginia has had 300 plus filings on COVID claims, which to me is, I mean, if it was New York, I'd say, okay, that's probably right. But for Virginia, that really surprises me. And I think while claim filings may be down somewhat in some arenas, I think it's just a matter of time before they shoot back up. And given what I just heard from the commissioner, it might be something we really hadn't thought out well enough. Wow, we're going to have, a third of our claim filings are going to be with the virus. That's huge. That's huge. I mean,
I heard a claims executive for a national TPA speak the other day, and he said as of his presentation, so that was last Tuesday, 2 days ago, they had over 10,000 first reports of injuries using the class code specifically for Clovis. So that gives you some indication of what might be going on. You and I, the three of us earlier today, were talking about what happened in Minnesota on Tuesday. The Minnesota House approved legislation ensuring first responders receive workers' compensation benefits. So it sounds like they've carved out a presumption in favor of first responders. Todd, you told us something was going on in some of the other states in that regard?
Yeah, there's been, over the past several years, there have been a number of states that have looked at presumptions, particularly for first responders. But Missouri just recently did an emergency rule regarding first responders tied to a statute they had that really even put more weight on the presumption. But there have been, in the last probably 5 years, several states that have been considering this. Minnesota is one that has looked at it 2 or 3 times and passed on passing it, and now it's passed. So, let me just say, I think that really becomes a challenge at times. And I'll use the example of PTSD, let's say. You have a police officer who has a presumption if he is at a school quelling a riot. But the teacher that's in the school doesn't get that same presumption. And I think that's going to be, long after I'm out of this business, that's going to be, I think, a debate that's going to grow. I just don't see how you carve out. What about the CNAs that work at a nursing home? What about, LVNs that work in a nursing home? Should they not have some presumption because they're exposed?
Yeah.
Interesting. But yeah, they're moving that way.
Yeah, I'll make a comment, and then I want to go on to a final area because we have a couple minutes left before we're going to allow for questions. My comment was, I read another article, and as you can imagine, in preparation for this, I read a lot. I read another article where certain companies were using different class codes for their workers. Instead of having retail workers be in a retail business class code, they were putting them in the class code of first responders, in the thought that if we do this, if we classify them as a first responder, they will get presumptions if these presumptions are ultimately adopted by our state legislature. Something to think about, folks. Okay, the final question that I have for the group, for the two of you, I read 2 articles recently that dealt with this, that gave me a great deal of food for thought. One was in Bloomberg.com, and the other one was the WashingtonPost.com. And the commentators suggested that this pandemic will change the way we work. To paraphrase one of the commentators, they said every pandemic shock leaves a legacy. Wes, what's the legacy that we're going to see from COVID-19 in workers' compensation specifically?
That's a very good observation. And in your business organizations, probably your IT and your IS people are always the people who are sort of tend to be more forward thinking. And one of the first response discussions I had with my IT manager in my agency, at the end of the conversation, I said, boy, this is just uncharted waters. And he looked at me and he said, this is going to change the way that all of us work forever. And I thought, well, that's a pretty bold statement. But again, looking back 2 or 3 weeks now, I mean, I think government agencies are going to look back at how they performed, and they're going to sort of have to take a good hard look at what are their needs for brick and mortar physical spaces. How comfortable are we with doing video presentations? I don't think I'd ever really, well, let's put it this way. I never initiated the video presentation on my own, scheduled a meeting and stuff, until I did one this morning, and it went off without a hitch. I've done probably 5 or 6 of them in the last 2 weeks, which is more than I've done in my entire life. It's actually getting to be pretty normal. So I just think we're gonna have a lot of people in government, particularly those agencies that are able to transition and have their processes be done more effectively through things like video conferencing, is going to change our perspective of what we need. I will add to that, though, that, and Paul, you commented on this earlier, that the judicial system is one place where there is just a foundational cornerstone need in our traditions and in our human behaviors to sort of have face-to-face contact and the ability to observe every movement and everything that's said, what we hear and what we see. So that's an important consideration too.
Todd, we're bumping up against our time here. Your final thoughts on that issue. How's it going to change us?
Well, I think the commissioner is exactly right. I would say that, I say it a different way. For years, there have been people pushing to do more teleconferencing, more telemedicine, more this, more that, and there has been a pushback. Once you let the horse out of the barn, how do you get him back in? And I think that's going to be a real challenge down the road. We've got now 300 people that work from home. They're kind of liking that. So how do we bring them back in? Once we've been operating like this, I think it's going to affect how we do business. I can't tell you all the ways, but I can remember back in the days when a basketball player got a cut in his eye, no one worried about it. Now they stop play, they bandage him up, they wipe the blood up, and they get him off the court. This is so much more pervasive than anything like that, that I think there are going to be a lot of changes that historically would not have been thought of,
Thank you. I'm going to plant a seed for those in the audience. One of the discussions we had, we don't really have time to get into it, is whether this pandemic is something that we need to think about a TRIA type of solution. And TRIA, as some of you know, is the Terrorist Relief Act that Congress has put together. If this really strikes people in a way that profoundly impacts businesses, and there's innumerable claims, I suspect that there's many carriers who simply did not anticipate this, have not planned for it, and would simply crush the carrier community. Having said that, Melissa, we have some questions.
Yes, so one of them is any discussion regarding the use of telemedicine for independent medical examinations?
There was our friend Chris Brigham did a presentation a couple of weeks ago on the use of independent medical exams through telemedicine. Judge, what are your thoughts?
I think we've had just a couple of remote examples of that in our system, nothing in the last few weeks. There are a lot of independent medical examiners who will say that they are able to observe or discover something by physically, seeing the patient. We do have a pretty widespread practice in Virginia of IMEs that are done through records reviews without a personal interview or physical examination of the patient. And so I would say a telephone IME would sort of be halfway in between the traditional model and the pure records review. I don't see any problem with it as a mechanism for doing things, and it may present some efficiencies. Our history and our tradition in Virginia is that we tend to give less weight to records reviews where the doctor has not actually seen the patient. So I think you're sort of, maybe you were adding another dot on the spectrum there of how things could be done, and it's going to have to be given appropriate weight.
In answer to the question, some of the jurisdictions specifically require a physical exam. And I think that those jurisdictions, without a modification of either their statute or their rule, it's directly on point, they wouldn't be seen. Let's take another question, and we'll see if it's one appropriate for Todd.
Yes. Any personal, purely anecdotal projections on the length of this economic downturn?
Oh, goodness. That's yours, Todd.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I can only tell you what I've told my staff, because I've got about 20 people that work remotely now, and they have been wanting to know when they can come back in. I think we're talking June, July before we start seeing a downturn enough where we would bring people back into the office. But again, that would just be a swipe. I think there will be some easing up of some things before then, but I think a general downturn, I think we're looking June and July, before we're really not growing anywhere in the country.
I've spent a fair amount of time recently talking to medical people, so I'll address this question from the sort of what I've learned from medical people, and that is, look at what happened with the flu epidemic in 1917. There were 3 waves. The first wave was the most serious, the second was pretty serious, and the third was less serious. So to the extent that this thing may be similar in the way that it presents itself to the medical community, it may be a long time. Why do I talk about the medical waves? Well, in large part, they're going to impact on the economy. And I think there are some pundits that are telling us that the economy probably will take longer to get back than the medical community and the other aspects of our life get back. So it may be a while.
And Paul, just for clarification, you said 1917, and in my introduction, you said I've been around forever. I didn't actually observe the waves in 1917. They a little bit before my time.
A few years before you.
A few years.
Another question?
We have one more. So it says Minnesota did it for all healthcare versus Missouri did it for EMTs. Would that be carved out?
I don't know if I understand the question. Could you repeat it, please?
Mm-hmm. Minnesota did it for all healthcare versus Missouri did it for EMTs. Would that be carved out?
Todd, what do you think?
If Minnesota basically, and I haven't read the statute yet, if they basically said all healthcare have a presumption, that is still a carve out, because you've got a segment of population that's going to get a presumption that other people are not. So that's still a carve out. It's just a broader carve out than we've seen before. Mostly we've seen around first responders. That's been the extent of what we've seen for the various carves out for PTSD or cancer or some of the other things. So, but I still consider that a carve out, because it's segregating a portion of the population workforce and will treat them a little differently than the rest of the workforce.
Yeah, I think the traditional workers' compensation policy wonk would tell you that we typically frown upon presumptions for a specific class. I think what you have to do is look at the work as opposed to the job title. And I think the people who are exposed similarly should have the same protections with a carve out. Wes, comments?
Yeah.
We talked a little bit earlier about maybe some of the general predictions would be that the COVID cases as workers' comp cases might not be big in terms of severity, but they will be big in terms of frequency. In other words, there'll be a lot of claims, and a lot of those claims won't be involved with a lot of medical expense or a long period of disability. Unfortunately, there are going to be a small number of those cases, that the ones that we're hearing about these days, where folks are transferred into ICU and stuff, and those are going to be incredibly expensive. So how that all gets weighed out when you say I'm going to take a class of workers and just give them a presumption for coverage is a very tricky thing. And I mean, it's purely within the realm of policymakers, the legislators who have the authority to write the laws. They're the ones that are going to have to decide those questions. I think I suspect every state is having some of those discussions with their legislative leadership and their executive leadership now about should we and can we, and if we do, who the heck is going to pay for it? I wanted to pose the question to Todd. I mean, something like that, how unsettling is that from sort of the industry perspective?
From what? I'm sorry.
From the industry perspective, if you start sort of having classes of people swept in for just okay, all first responders who contract COVID are presumed to be covered under workers' comp.
Yeah. I think, again, I go back to the industry bases its projections on historical numbers. And so whenever you start adjusting how those numbers will be played out, I think it's concerning to it would be if I'm an insurance company, it would certainly be concerning to me because I can tell you, I didn't price today's claims based on a COVID-19. I priced it on the history. So
Yes.
I think that would be unsettling. And I think it would be like, okay, are we going to have something like now the black lung carve out, that it's not even handled necessarily in workers' comp, it's handled in a separate process. And it's not the first time, from my perspective, that this has raised its head. If you look at the petrochemical industry to some degree, they've dealt with occupational disease for a long time in contact and as well as respiratory. And they have successfully prevented that from being carved out of the Maine statute. I think I think from the industry standpoint, it would be unsettling. If I were an industry person, I wouldn't necessarily want to see that.
We're just about out of time, and the answer, Todd, is going to be we're going to develop a vaccine. Ladies, are we?
There you go.
Good?
We're good.
Thank you. Todd, I want to thank you very much. You've been terrific. Wes, thank you very much. You've been terrific as well. And I hope
Paul, let me just say, I just want to say that being on the panel with both you and the commissioner has certainly improved my status, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Up till then, Todd.
All right, dude. Y'all take care, gang. Good seeing y'all again.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bye.